So there's one, I think, very important aspect of the Bible that we need to understand. And sometimes as Christians we haven't really been taught about this, and that is God's plan with nations. So we read already in the book of Genesis about how God created nations. We know when with the flood under Noah, God saved Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And those 3 sons of Noah became 70 nations. We read about it in Genesis chapters 9 and 10. God has a purpose with those nations. It's part of his plan of creation and redemption, because those nations then took the step of trying to build the Tower of Babel. And God intervened. He said, you are trying to create a name for yourselves on the earth. So he dispersed the nations throughout the world, gave them different languages, and sent them into different parts of the world. And then he called Abraham out of Babylon to come to Canaan. He said, I will create through you a people that will be a blessing to the nation. All the nations of the world will be blessed through you. And we read even the final book of the Bible, Revelation, even the last chapter of Revelation, God's promise in the kingdom, everlasting kingdom. There'll be the river and the trees along the river of life. The leaves of the trees will be for the healing of the nations. Now, if you take that idea of nations and understand it in the modern context, the nations have a relationship with Israel and the Jewish people. Okay, the Jewish people is not a nation like any other nation because they were created miraculously. The child Isaac, the child of the promise to Abraham, was a miracle child, born to Sarah and Abraham in their old age. So God did a miracle to create this new nation called the Jewish people, Israel, to be a blessing to the nations. And we as Christians, we are called to be light and salt into our nations. And I believe very strongly that God has a real purpose with nations, and it's got to do with the way they treat the Jewish people. And the judgment of the nations, which is promised in the Bible, God is going to judge nations according to the way they deal with the Jewish people. This will be their, as it were, the criterion upon which they're going to be blessed or not blessed. And we've seen through history, the nations that bless the Jewish people are blessed. And in the kingdom, the millennium kingdom that will come under Christ, you know, the nations will go, it says in Zechariah 14, up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So there's this amazing purpose with nations. But what we see at the moment is the nations having a choice. They're either going to support this restoration of the Jewish people to the land, or they're going to oppose it. And this is exactly what's happening in the United Nations at the moment. And that's why I think it's an extremely important phase of history that we're going through. It's a little confusing. It's hard to understand because there's so much going on. There's so much politics around Jerusalem. And we have President Trump's declaration. So it seems like it's some conflict between the Arab world and the United States of America. But it's not. It's about God's purposes with Jerusalem and the restoration of Jerusalem as the place where Jesus Christ will reign as Messiah. And the law of the law of the Lord shall go forth from Jerusalem, the word from Zion, in Isaiah chapter 2. So when the Jewish people in 1967, in the Six-Day War, they, in a miraculous war which they should never have won, but they did, obtained control over the whole city of Jerusalem, including the old city, which for 19 years had been under Jordanian control. The Jordanians destroyed every synagogue. They wiped out every trace of Jewish life in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel regained control, restored the old city of Jerusalem, restored the synagogues. They made sure that Christians could live there in peace and Muslims access to the holy sites. But now the Arab world especially is opposed to Israel's having control over the West Bank. It's partly a spiritual issue, it's partly religious competition. The Islamic world cannot accept the idea of Jewish sovereignty over this Islamic territory. That's why the Temple Mount is so important. It's become the spiritual battle between, I think, the Islamic world and the Judeo-Christian world. And I think as Christians we have to understand the importance of God restoring Jerusalem to the Jewish people. It's a complete fiction to say that Israel is somehow preventing the Christians or the Muslims from having access to their holy sites. Under Israeli control, Christians and Muslims are able to practice their faith fully because Israel is democracy. So the idea that somehow Israel is misusing Jerusalem, I think is a complete fable. What the Islamic world actually wants is to cut off East Jerusalem so the Jews will have no access to their holy sites. And I think for Christians as well it will be very, very difficult.